try to fly.
Hello everyone, I am glad to welcome you to my channel. Today we have a very interesting transplant because we have such an interesting specimen, the Equestris locus variety. Here we have a mother and already such a huge baby on the peduncle. But what is most interesting is that this baby also formed a baby at the end of the peduncle, at the end of flowering. You see? Therefore, it is time to transplant and separate this baby from the mother. It already has a very well-developed root system. As you can see, the roots in active growth, which will be favorable for the adaptation of the orchid in the new substrate. Well, let's begin. Yes, I forgot to say that this Phalaenopsis lives in moss. After buying this orchid, it came to me in moss like all teenagers. I did not adapt it to the bark because a very large part of my orchids are planted in moss as a permanent substrate. Not temporary, but permanent, because it makes it easier for me to care for my orchids, or to be more precise, watering. Therefore, now we will not change the conditions for the orchids. We will also plant it in moss. And, accordingly, the child, too. I wanted to say that we will plant in a group planting, that is, in one pot. Now we will definitely get started. Let's go. For this we will need moss. I have already prepared it. I use spag moss. New Zealand moss is sold in pressed briquettes, very convenient for storage, does not take up much space, and is very easy to prepare for use. To do this, just put water in this briquette for a short period of up to 5 minutes. The moss is saturated and becomes ready for use. But the most important thing, of course, is to squeeze out excess water and leave the moss just slightly damp. I have already prepared the moss in advance. Expanded clay is a must for drainage. 2 pots, because it is not clear which orchid has which root system and which one we will need. And garden shears, pruning shears, which we have processed in advance. Now we take our orchid, and the most interesting and exciting moment is the separation of cutting our baby. We need to take and find a place with a small piece of stalk. It's done. So look what a self-sufficient big baby she is. I'd say she's practically the same size as her mother. I've had it since last spring, that is, when the mother finished flowering with the formation of the baby. It looked like this now. It was last spring, and it hung on me for a year, and in a year it grew to this size. I think that's a good result in 1 year. Mommy did her best, she fed her baby. Well, look, the root system is good. All the roots are intact, so I am not going to cut anything off. There are no dry or rotten roots, because it wasn't in the substrate, it was in the air. So the only thing that could be wrong with the root system is that there could be some dry roots somewhere. But I do not have dry roots, because very often when I watered this orchid, I would dip the roots in water and leave them for about 20 minutes, so that the root system is well developed and not dried out. This leaf is the very first leaf that broke through. At the beginning, we will remove it. We do not need it because we need to deepen the orchid. This leaf will interfere with us. All scales should be removed after removing the bottom leaves. It is very convenient to do this with pliers or tweezers. I'm going to use these. Just a second. These new tweezers. These are my eyebrow tweezers. I'm very comfortable using them in cases like this. You remove all these scales. You don't leave anything behind. You always do that with your orchids. I completely cleaned the neck of the orchid, and it came out clean. I wanted to say, and continue on the subject of roots. If you're transplanting an orchid and you have bad rotten roots, or they are about to rot, take this medicine. It is Previcur Energy, a very effective root rot remedy. Dilute according to the instructions on the label and soak the root system for 30 minutes. Depending on the size of the plant, you can even completely immerse the plant in the container, but do not forget to dry it well afterward. First, it is better to turn the plant to drain excess moisture, and then well soaked all the sinuses with absorbent cotton so that the moisture does not remain in the pockets, so that there was no problem with rotting. But in our case, we will not do this, because there is no such need. With the baby sorted out, we separated it and prepared it for planting. Now we're going to take care of the mother. We take out the orchid. And you know, I transplanted it earlier this spring. I moved it to a bigger pot. Don't mind the green stuff in the moss. That's from a lot of sun. So this moss is good, and I will continue to use it for transplanting. In the period after transplanting, you can see how the roots love the moss, how fat and juicy they have become over time. In general, I have been growing orchids for a long time, and I have made sure that if you have the conditions at home for this substrate, you can safely use moss as a permanent substrate. However, not everyone has the conditions at home in winter to keep orchids in moss, because many people, as I have already learned from my subscribers, have cold rooms where orchids are located, poor heating. In such cases, this substrate is obviously not for you. Because wet moss does not dry well, moisture will be constantly present near the roots, which will cause the root system to rot. So look, if your conditions do not allow it, then it is better not to use moss as a permanent substrate. My house gets very hot in the winter. We have very good heating, warm floors, so moss is ideal for my orchids. Since I only transplant orchids and combine group planting with a baby, and as I said, the transplanting of this orchid was quite recent, the need to completely remove this moss is not. I leave this moss, but it is necessary to remove not very good roots. There are rotted roots, but I would say it was most likely due to stress. Who does not know, I will say that after transplanting an orchid, part of the roots in any case necessarily lost. The orchid discounts part of the roots, so these bad roots, they are not much. They formed after the first transplant. If you notice, I don't cut off the bad roots, I pull off the rotten flesh of the root and leave the cords. Of course, they have no ability to hold moisture, because the root itself is no longer there. But if the substrate itself is moist, then such a root will continue to provide moisture to the flower itself. We also remove old stems from old flower stems. We also remove old dead scales from the neck of the orchid. We have freed the orchid from the scales from the old roots. I do not remove the expanded clay, because the roots have already grown into these stones, and there is no need to damage the roots, because we will still pour drainage. So leave them. We choose a pot according to the size of the root system. I measured, and I have this pot that fits our two orchids well. We're going to put them parallel to each other. When you do this kind of planting, you always put the plants like this, parallel to each other. I also point all the flower stems in the same direction. This is done so that when you place the plants, the stems will look in one direction and decorate the overall appearance of the room. Let's put our orchids aside for now. We will take a pot and fill the bottom with expanded clay. As I said, We are going to use the moss that was previously planted in this orchid. The only thing I did was to remove a very green flowering moss. I separated it, and the rest we will use now. First of all, it is good for the adaptation of the orchid because it contains all the useful microflora. Now we put a small amount of moss on the bottom, a little at the same time, crushed it. Now take 2 orchids. Be very careful with the root system so as not to damage it, because young roots are very fragile. So you have to be very careful. Now we start to wrap our roots with moss. We put a little bit inside. We don't clog it up. We just gently wrap the moss around the roots. Then we gently place the orchids in our pot. Carefully distribute the rosettes so that they sit nicely in the pot. Now that we have planted our orchids evenly, we can begin to fill in the voids created by the moss with sticks. Do not tamp. Just make an air balloon around the roots. Make sure that the roots have access to oxygen. The substrate should always be aerated. In the past, there was no such tendency to make holes in pots, but now even pots with holes are sold, because it has been proven that orchids need oxygen close to the roots. This is the basic principle when planting and transplanting orchids in any substrate, whether it's moss or bark. Whatever you are not planting a flower in, be sure to provide air circulation. The neck of the base of the orchid we do not deepen. We leave it on the surface of the substrate to avoid rotting neck, because it is the most dangerous thing that can be when the flower disease. It is very rare to save the plant, so the neck should be moderately deepened. I think I've done everything. I show you, you see the voids that are there. I did not fill with moss. There's enough substrate for the orchids to keep them moist. But just these pockets here will be a favorable condition for air circulation. Now I'm going to clean everything up and show you the final result we got. Well, our group transplantation and separation of the baby from the mother is complete. Now, our baby that we took from the stem will grow her own baby. Now, it needs a period of acclimation to get used to the substrate, but I think her root system is good, and she will get through this period successfully. Here is such a composition of 2 already almost the same size. Orchids came to an end. If someone was interesting, useful, subscribe, put likes and bells, because there are many more interesting things ahead of us. Goodbye everyone, and see you all again.